right. Well, looks like many more have joined us online, which is great. So great to see your names and a face. Thanks, Jeremy, for showing your face. And we're going to do Snap Talks now. So we will be hearing from Doris after Theresa, who is in the room. We're going to start with Theresa this evening. But yeah, I've just really, like I've said every time, I've enjoyed getting to know everybody better through Snap Talks, and I've enjoyed getting to know Theresa better through Tuesday nights, and just here, she's just a lovely person who really cares, very kind-hearted, walks the talk, and genuine. So I look forward to hearing from your sister, so come on.
How's this? Okay. I am so old school that I actually copied and pasted. I cut things out and put them on there. So I am like rebelling against technology in all its forms. So, but I was praying about what to talk about, and being that I'm kind of probably towards the end of our Snap Talks, I was thinking I had one idea, but then as the Snap Talks kind of went on, I felt like the Lord wanted me to talk about suffering. And just because of a lot of the stories that you guys have shared, I thought, wow, we've really endured a lot as a body and suffered. And so the name of my Snap Talk is called Daddy, Can You Fix This? And I had written a poem a while back entitled that, and it came from the heart of how you see your daddy. Like when you're a kid, you think if something's broke, it doesn't matter how bad, you take it to your dad and you're like, fix this, and somehow you in your heart, even if your dad's not mechanical, you feel like he's gonna fix it. And so kind of the same as like my dad can beat up your dad kind of thing. And so I think when we're going through suffering, there's not a part of your heart that's so broken that God can't fix it. And so I want to read you another poem that I wrote. I like poetry. This one was from 2015, and I had been diagnosed with stage 4 endometriosis and uterine cancer. And I wrote this. It says, "Now I am small, about the age of 10. Gone is the woman who draws the eyes back when. I am small, my speech even hushed. I am a child, broken, weak, and crushed. I am small, abandoned I cry. I am so little, I can barely even try. Where did that woman go, so confident, so bold? She is so little now, she did not grow old. As a child, I come to you, Jesus. You are my only hope. A needy little one. I can't care for myself. I mope. Do you see me, El Roi, God who sees? Do you have compassion? I'm broken on my knees. Kiss this child on the forehead and tuck her in goodnight. Her teddy bear has gone and she is scared without the light. Please find me soon before I waste away. Please rescue me, Abba, don't wait another day. Daddy, my hands are reaching. Pick me up, beloved one. Hold me in your arms until the morning comes. I need you now, I need you now. Don't go, I don't care how. And that was just kind of something I wrote when I was feeling like when someone says the C word, you're kind of like, and I've lost a lot of family to that C word, and I thought, oh gosh, it's my turn, and so that was really scary. And so Romans 8:18 says, consider the sufferings of this present time not worth comparing to the glory that is to be revealed to us. And when I read that again, I thought, it's not worth comparing. Like when we suffer, sometimes we think, gosh, this is the worst thing I've ever been through, or, or you compare your suffering, well, she had all this happen and I only had this, so, it's not so bad, I shouldn't really complain. And so, but I just thought, wow, suffering reveals glory. That is so cool. Like, wow, I never really thought that. And the other thing that came to mind, and this is something Graham Cook is really responsible for saying, is what is it that you want to be for me now that you couldn't be for me before I had cancer? It's like sometimes I don't think God gives you these things, but it's like, what could you be for me that you couldn't be before? And so that was like a question. And when you read this poem, it's like, obviously, I there was a lot of things I wanted him to be for me. And so I also was, we found out that I had this genetic mutation that gives, it's called BRCA2, and it's causes most people who have it to have about an 80% chance of breast cancer. And so during this time, I decided that I would do a prophylactic double mastectomy, and then I had a hysterectomy because of the other cancer. And so I just remember, like, okay, my whole life is like in shock, you know. And we had an exchange student from Georgia at the time, and he was so cute. I said, well, I'm not sure this is kind of what you were expecting for a host family, so if you want to go to another family, it's okay. I mean, it's kind of dramatic over here right now. And he just looked at me and he goes, I would not leave my mom. I would not leave you. And it just like melted my heart, like he was not going to leave me, you know. And it's thought, I mean, he was comfortable and he was having a good year, but in my mind, I thought that's not what I wanted for you to have, you know. And so, but the reason for suffering, and this is something that I found out a lot, my suffering started when I was about 6 years old. I could say I would go to my grandma's house, and one of my relatives started molesting me at the age of 6. And so I've known suffering my whole life, but I could never figure out why. Like, why does God allow these kind of things? You know, when you see a 6-year-old, you look at them and go, you know, like it's just unfathomable. But it's like 2 Corinthians 1:3 through 4 says, praise be to God, Father of our Lord, Yeshua the Messiah, compassionate Father, God of all encouragement and comfort, who encourages us in all our trials so that we can encourage others in whatever trials they may be undergoing with the encouragement we ourselves receive from God. And so after I had my first 2 children, we started having problems, and it was probably because of the endometriosis, losing babies. And I remember being in church, and there was all these young ladies, and they were all pregnant, and they were having babies, and I kept losing babies. And I remember standing there thinking, as we were worshiping, I'm not going to sing. And I was just like standing there, and this woman came up behind me, and she just kind of hugged me, and she says, I know you don't want to sing. And I said, and she says, and I know why. And she says, but you need to sing. And then she started to tell me how she had a stillborn and 3 miscarriages. And she comforted me in a way that none of the other people that didn't go through that were able to. And so it was at that moment I realized God doesn't waste our suffering. You know, if you allow the things that happen to you, and if you look at them like, yeah, I know this really stinks right now, but somewhere down the road, it's not going to be wasted. There's going to be like somebody you run into in a grocery store, or who knows where. It can be so random, and it never ceases to amaze me how the Lord always is using these like times of suffering, and even things that I didn't think, like, how will this ever impact somebody? This is kind of, you know. And so anyway, so God doesn't waste your pain. There's redemptive power of joy in the midst of suffering. And one of the other things that I thought was interesting is, you know, you never stumble while you're sitting down. Do you ever notice that? So if you're if you just decide you want to sit down and you want to stop and you want to give up on life, you're not going to stumble. But it's when we stumble that we encounter things that causes us to have compassion for other people. And Viktor Frankl, he's one of my favorites. He wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And he when he was in the concentration camps, he tried to figure out why some people would be in the concentration camp and they would just die like within a couple weeks, and others had been there for months and were emaciated and they just kept going. And he thought, I have to understand this. So, and I think he was a psychologist, he was a doctor, and so he started doing kind of his own research. And one thing he noticed was, and this is a quote from him, he said, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. The one thing you can't take away from me is the way I choose to respond to what you do to me. The last of one's freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given circumstance. Happiness cannot be pursued, we must ensue. Life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by the lack of meaning and purpose. And so I feel like no matter what happens to you, whether you've had childhood trauma or you have cancer, you get to decide. And I crack up because one of these days I'm going to write a book. It's called They All Got Away with It. And I grew up in inner city Detroit. And so as you can imagine, it was pretty violent in the 90s. I think the crack epidemic had come in, and there was no police. And so unfortunately, a lot of times I was a victim of a lot of violent crime. And not one single person ever went to jail or even was arrested or questioned. And so, but the book I thought I would write would be about like how I forgave them, because I didn't want to give them any more power, and so when we suffer, a lot of times we can decide to be bitter or better. And I always tell my kids that. I say, you get to choose. And so it's kind of like, for many years I was very bitter, and I realized being sad about seeing good things happen to people just made me unhappy. And as you become, one of the things about suffering and watching my daughter have 2 children, and it's different when you watch your children have children. She like literally had 2 babies with no medication, and I was just like, wow. But what she did was she had trained herself to take suffering and to be calm and to let that suffering do its work. Every time a contraction came, she thought, my baby's a little closer. And she just allowed that suffering to do its work. And I thought, wow, what if we all looked at suffering that way? Like, what kind of work are you doing here? What are you birthing? And when I go to the dentist, I'm pretty panicked and freaked out. And one of the hygienists said, if you put your hands like this, instead of like this on the chair, it won't hurt as much. And I thought, what? And she said, well, because when your hands are like this, you're more at rest. But when you're like this, you start gripping and you start breathing different. And I was like, oh. So now every time I go get my teeth cleaned, I'm like, and it does work. And so that was another thing I was thinking about suffering, is how suffering, if we allow it and we don't fight it, instead of saying, why is this happening to me and when can I get out of it, or when will this be over? Okay, Lord, what are you trying to teach me that you couldn't teach me before? And so let's see. And there's actually it's actually chemical in your brain too. They say there is actually a moment between stimulus and response. When you are stimulated and before you can respond, there is a moment that happens in our physiology. And I call that moment the space where we get to decide. That is the space where we have the power to choose. And so your body is actually made up for that. So when people say, oh, you made me angry, well, no, or, they can't really do anything to you unless you let them. And I always say, if you think that that's not the case and you're having a big fight and someone knocks on the door or your phone rings and you're like, ah, and then you're like, hello. You can control it, right? It's like, oh, the pastor's at the door. Hi, glad you could come by. And everybody's fine, right? So I think a lot of times we don't think we can control it, but we can. And our brain says we can. And so with practice, you get better at it. And so that's one thing over the years I've been trying to do is just when something happens and I feel like, ooh, I think, nope, I got a moment to think about this. And I'm not going to give that person that much power, or I'm not going to, I don't want to live my life as a hypocrite. I know we all have times where we do. As Christians, we want to be this person, up here. And there's who we think we are sometimes, and then there's who we really are. But I feel like we're all practicing, and so it doesn't matter, like, if you stumble, at least you're walking, right? At least you're going somewhere. You might fall on your face a couple times, but that's okay. That's part of the journey. And so, let's see, I got 4 minutes. Okay. And so I would say one of the best lessons I ever learned was when I tried to hike Pikes Peak and I didn't make it. And I had told everybody, I'm hiking to the top of Pikes Peak, and I was so proud of myself. Maybe I was a little arrogant. I don't know. I was in the best shape of my life, so I thought, oh, this won't be hard. And I got up about 1.5 miles on the trail, and the sun came up, and it was the most amazing, beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my life. When it cracked the horizon, the rays started racing across because I was up just high enough. And like when the rays of sun hit me, I like literally almost was slain in the spirit. I was like, whoa. And I thought, boy, it's going to take me a while to get to the top if this stuff keeps happening. And I just thought, wow, you just totally missed it, right? But I didn't know that at the time. So I kept hiking. I had felt like the Lord said, meet me at the top. I'm going to, have this wonderful prophetic word for you. And so I get to bar camp, and I'm literally, my lips are blue. And the girl I'm hiking with is like, we need to turn around. And I said, no, I don't want to turn around. I just want to accomplish something in life. And she just started laughing hysterically. And I was just like, what? She's like, you're like one of the most accomplished people I know. And I was thinking, okay, I'm glad you think that, So we start marching down, and I'm mad. I'm like kicking the dirt, and God's laughing. He's cracking up. And I was like, why did you tell me to go up here if you knew I wasn't going to make it? And I just heard God's voice real quiet. He goes, I never told you to hike. You could have drove a car. And I thought, why did I make that so hard? But a couple of years later, I decided I was going to hike. And that's where I think I learned the most, is that some days when you look at the mountain, you get overwhelmed. And when my dad was dying of cancer 1.5 years ago, he would sometimes look at that mountain, and you could just see, he was just like, ugh. And I said, Dad, it's better to look at how far you've come. Some days you just, when you're hiking up the mountain and you're at bar camp, you either have to go up or down. Like, you can't just sit on the trail and go, well, I don't think I'm going to do this. You have to go. And so I said, some days I could only get to that rock. And then other days I'm like, oh, I'm going to get up to those trees over there. But when I'd look at the mountain, I'd say, oh, it's so far. And the people were little, like this big, and I said, okay, I'm just going to keep turning around. And when I saw Colorado Springs down there, I thought, oh, look at you. You're way up there, And so I always tell kids that. I tell people who are struggling that. I just say, when you get on that road of suffering, sometimes all you can do is stand. Just that day, you might take 2 steps and you can't breathe very well. I found out later that I had gotten respiratory edema the day that I tried to hike, and my lungs were filling up with fluid, and it wasn't because I just wasn't like good enough to make it. I physically was suffocating. And so I had a physical reason not to make it, but I think, I learned a lot from that. And so got to the top. My kids were up there. My husband, they had a sign, congratulations. And I had some good friends that had walked with me, and I was the last one. I was always the last one coming up the rear. And they would hike up and they would wait. They were all like 15 years younger than me too. And when we got to the last little bit, they just waited and they were like, you go first. And I just thought, that is the kind of people you need in your life when you have a journey, is the ones that are going to cheer for you, that are going to say, no, I know that you tried this and it was devastating and you were really disappointed. We're going to like cheer for you the last like 5 steps of this so you can like have all the kudos. And we were wearing these crazy socks, and it was just a really glorious time. And so I just encourage you, when you see suffering, don't put your hands on the steering wheel or the chair like this. Yep. Oh, perfect timing. Anyway, so anybody, questions?
All right, that was fantastic. Let me set my 10 minutes. Hold on. All right, well, I actually want to ask a question. Thank you, first of all, just for sharing your heart and some of your experiences and suffering. Some of us, it's not the most comfortable of topics, obviously, or comfortable things to go through either, but I appreciate your transparency, Theresa. So one thing that I notice about you, in contrast to other people I've come across in my life, or even myself at times, sometimes suffering can impact people that don't continue to reflect a soft heart like you do, and the beauty that radiates from your life. Some people get stuck there, hate God, hate the world, just are very bitter people. So I know you gave like lots of wonderful nuggets in your perspective of sharing, but is there something that you might share in terms of what would be one of those highlights for someone who's stuck, that made a difference for you to keep your heart soft and just to, really shine so brightly in spite of suffering?
I think maybe having someone else who's been through the same thing go to them. Like a lot of times when, like Greg, I'm sure when his wife passed, people probably said some stuff that was really dumb, that was probably hurtful. People say dumb stuff, and they're trying to comfort you, but they don't really know how to because they haven't been through it. So I think finding someone that has been through a similar thing to talk to that person, because there's things I've been through and I think, wow, that's so horrible, but it's not that horrible compared to this person who lost their son. And I think, gosh, I can't even imagine going through that. Where some people are like, I can't imagine going through what you've been through. But one thing that I can say for me personally is that God gives you the grace when you need it, not before. Because I always tried to figure out, how did these people survive the Holocaust? Like hiding in sewers, having to keep their babies quiet, some having to kill their own babies because they were crying and making too much noise. And I think God gives you the grace at the moment that you're in it, not before. And so I think that's what's helped me, is just been able to, I think because I was so negative before and I was so unhappy, and then when I gave my life to the Lord in 97, I realized there was a different way, and so I started realizing I got to choose, even though I didn't get to choose when I was a victim, a lot of times. And so that gave me a real freedom, I believe, And so, and I would just say, pray for God's grace to kind of settle on him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amen. And if I could just add a comment, because I know it's not just people in the room that are going to watch this, but this is such an important topic that people might watch this in weeks or months to come. I feel like it's one of the key things that helped me was recognizing in the nature of God. I used to think that God, controlled all things and put things on you, and that'll really mess you up big time if you think God is causing these horrible abuses and sickness and tragedies, and nothing's further from the truth. That's not his nature. And so, but if we believe that, that's a really hard thing to process, an abusive father like that. He's not the one doing it, but he's the one that wants to comfort you and minister to you to grow through it.
One reason that I feel like I don't feel a lot of angst is because I realized that was their free will. They used their free will against me.
Exactly.
And it wasn't God.
Exactly.
And I've had a lot of healing where God has showed me, like, he wept when those things happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
It broke his heart.
That's right.
That those things happened.
And that's a key thing I don't want us to miss, because that's, I think, one of the biggest stumbling blocks for people that the enemy uses to get people to think God is this horrible one. How can you get close to that? So thank you.
Jen. So I have a question after I make a comment. So my comment is 3 years ago, I found that I had a tumor in my brain, and I made the choice to just lean back into Jesus, Papa, and the Spirit, because my husband said he saw a vision of the three of them in the doctor, and that just gave me all the faith I needed. So that was great. And I just kind of leaned into God and went through the whole process with joy and a lot of revelation. I told Jesus, I told God, please reveal yourself to me, show me you. And it happened through the whole 2 weeks in the hospital. So that was awesome, and I get what you're saying. And so that's just my testimony. And then what is BRCA2?
It's actually a genetic mutation, and they're finding out now that a lot of cancers are caused by mutations in the DNA, and that they can't necessarily always cure cancer, but the new thing that they're doing is finding out if you have this, well then, if this is the cancer that you predominantly would get, then they can take these parts out, and so in a way they're curing the cancer before you get it, and so that's like Angelina Jolie had BRCA2, and she got a lot of like flack for having a double mastectomy. People think, oh, you just want to just get new boobs or something. It's like, no, I have an 80% chance of getting breast cancer, and they're trying to kill me. So I mean, I'm scrappy. I'm like, no, you're not. So off you go.
Really appreciate your talk and your testimony tonight. I found sometimes when you think you're spiritually mature, like you can handle something you didn't expect, an event. All of a sudden something happens to you where you go down a completely different life path, not an event, but a completely different paradigm, and your life becomes a different journey than you thought. For example, widowed parenthood. Never was happily married, crazy in love, never dreamt I'd be down this path. So that can lead to some very bitter moments. And it's a challenge. There's this wonderful pastor out of Singapore who I'm so indebted to, because he gave me some tools. And one of the things you can say, the power of your words, life and death are in the power of the tongue, it says in Proverbs. And I found out that there's something you can say that might feel hypocritical, but it's incredibly useful, especially when it feels hypocritical. When you wake up in the morning by yourself and you were married, that makes you so angry. And I have a little girl to wake up and take to kindergarten and first grade. I can't be angry, be a bitter household. So the first thing I do when I wake up, especially if I'm feeling like the most ungodly, angry person in the world, as I say, according to 1 Corinthians 5:21. It's based on Jesus and his cross, not based on my feelings. I am the righteousness of God in Christ Jesus. Regardless of what my thoughts are doing, regardless of my emotions, regardless if I'm behaving maturely or not. I am the righteousness of God in Christ Jesus. And it says in that verse, because of what Jesus did on the cross, not because of me. So if Jesus' blood shed for us is reliable, then I most definitely, right now, I am the righteousness of God in Christ Jesus. And that preacher was so wonderful out of Singapore, because what he said to do is go, say it especially when you feel like a hypocrite, especially when you've blown it. That's the time to say it. Not when you think you've got it all together. That, that doesn't, it works the least. So that's been a wonderful, powerful tool to go through a valley experience. Because there's a million and one things I still don't like about this path that I ended up on. Can't stand it. Don't like it. But I found some pretty amazing things there. Jesus does not leave you. He will never forsake you.
Well, and I always tell people, well, you got up this morning, so you'll have 100% success rate at surviving this.
That's great. Teresa, thank you so much. That was awesome. Bless you.